To paraphrase Ronald Reagan, here we go again. Treasury Secretary Jack Lew has warned us that the federal government will bump up against the statutory debt ceiling on Tuesday, November 3rd. Shortly after that, on December the 11th, the fiscal year 2016 continuing resolution will expire, bringing the prospects of yet another government shutdown. Absent a budget deal to suspend sequestration and lift spending caps imposed under the Budget Control Act, we face draconian spending cuts that will harm both our economic recovery and our national security. Meanwhile, authority for the Export-Import Bank has expired already, and authority to spend surface transportation funding will expire at the end of this month. This is no way to run a government. It is time to end this mindless fiscal brinksmanship and negotiate a comprehensive budget deal that resolves all these issues. The American people demand and deserve no less. But first, we must act on the debt ceiling. With respect to the debt ceiling, Treasury Secretary Lew wrote to House Speaker John Boehner on October 15th, warning that extraordinary measures to forestall hitting the debt statutory ceiling will exhaust as soon as November the 3rd. At that point, the federal government will have a cash balance of about $30 billion, but will be facing obligations totaling as much as $60 billion on certain days. As Secretary Lew wrote in his letter, operating the United States government with no borrowing authority, with only the cash on hand on a given day, would profoundly be irresponsible. As I wrote previously, we anticipate that a remaining cash balance of less than $30 billion would be depleted quickly. In fact, we do not foresee any reasonable scenario in which it would last for an extended period of time. The government makes approximately 80 million payments a month, including Social Security and veterans benefits, military salaries, Medicare reimbursements, and many others. In the absence of congressional action, Treasury would be unable to satisfy all of these obligations for the first time in the history of the United States. The creditworthiness of the United States is an essential component of our strength as a nation. Protecting that strength is the sole responsibility of Congress, because only Congress can extend the nation's borrowing authority. Moreover, as you know, increasing the debt limit does not authorize any new spending. It simply allows Treasury to pay for expenditures Congress has already approved in full and on time. Well, I couldn't agree with Secretary Lew more. What the raising the debt ceiling does is allow us to pay for what has already been appropriated by Congress for spending. This has nothing to do with how much we're going to spend as a nation. It has everything to do as to whether we're going to honor our bills. The United States of America has to pay its bills, just as when American families use a credit card. When a bill is due, it needs to be paid in a timely manner. At no time in our history has our country been unable or unwilling to pay its debts. Raising our debt ceiling has to be done, not so we can spend more, as Secretary Lew pointed out, but that the bills we've already have are paid. Default is not an option. Now, some Republicans, particularly Action in the House, have suggested that the federal government can prioritize its payments to avoid a technical default. Some have dubbed this the China pay first because, as you know, much of our public debt is held by the Chinese. It's disturbing that our Republican colleagues are even considering such an proposal. It simply won't work. The federal government makes 80 to 100 million payments monthly, including Social Security and veterans benefits, military salaries, and Medicare reimbursements. The Treasury Department doesn't have the manpower, the computer capability, or guidelines to sort out who gets paid. The Bipartisan Policy Center has prepared a comprehensive analysis of what happens if we hit the so-called X date without lifting the debt ceiling. As the Bipartisan Policy Center notes, the reality would be chaotic, with the Treasury Department being forced to pick winners and losers. We might have to shut down the entire Justice Department, the federal courts, the Federal Highway Administration, the Federal Aviation Administration, and other agencies. These are critically important missions that people of this country depend upon. We might have to suspend tax refunds, refunds that taxpayers desperately need. We might have to stop paying federal workers, 30% of whom are veterans and contractors. As the Bipartisan Policy Center notes, on a day-to-day basis, handling all payments for important popular programs, e.g. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, defense, military active duty pay, will quickly be impossible. Delaying the decision to increase the debt limit jeopardizes our economy and our standing in the world. The mere suggestion that the federal government might miss a payment caused Standard & Poor's to downgrade our sovereign credit rating from AAA to AA+ after the 2011 debt limit standoff. Mr. President, a default is a default. You can't pick winners and losers. If we default on any of our debt, it will affect our credit worthiness and our bond ratings. If we don't transfer the payments to state and local governments, which a large part of their budget depends upon receiving their federal share of programs, it will cause state and local governments to default, affecting their bond ratings, again increasing the cost of borrowing, a hidden tax, not a hidden tax, a tax of additional to the taxpayers of this country. During the last debt limit showdown in 2013, yields for targeted securities and secondary markets rose from 1 basis point in mid-September to over 50 basis points just prior to the resolution of the standoff in October. The Government Accounting Office estimates that the 2013 impasse cost the federal government between $38 to $70 million in added interest payments to service on the debt. This is what taxpayers have to pay because the Congress did not, in a timely way, increase the debt limit. So it's not only default, it's the time we take. We've got to act now. Should have acted well before now. If we keep playing with fire, we're going to get burned, and burned badly. In addition to lifting the debt ceiling, which needs to be done first, we need to negotiate a comprehensive budget deal. Last week, administration officials announced that the FY 2015 deficit was $44 billion, $44 billion, less than the previous year. Last year's deficit was $439 billion. This is still too high, but let's put the number in context. It was the lowest share of our economy at 2.5% since 2007. As Treasury Secretary Lew pointed out, under the President's leadership, the deficit has been cut by roughly 3/4 as a share of the economy since 2009, the fastest sustained deficit reduction since just after World War II. It's important to remember that the previous administrations inherited, the Bush administration inherited the biggest surpluses in history and promptly squandered them to 2 ill-conceived tax cuts and a war in Iraq that was paid for on a credit card. And then we had the biggest recession since the Great Depression. This was the situation the Obama administration inherited, from surpluses to deficits to recessions. The Obama administration took effective, extraordinary measures to pull the economy back from the brink. Economists Alan Blinder and Mark Zandi, writing for the Center of Budget Policy Priorities, estimated that without the measures taken in the late 2008 and early 2009, the peak-to-trough decline in the real gross domestic product, which was barely over 4%, would have closed to a stunning 14%. The economy would have contracted by more than 3 years, more than twice as long as it did. More than 17 million jobs would have been lost, about twice the actual number. The unemployment rates would have peaked at just under 16 rather than at the actual 10%. The budget deficits would have grown to more than 20% of GDP, about the double the actual peak of 10%, topping at $2.8 trillion in FY 2011. My point, Mr. President, is the actions taken by the Obama administration pulled our economy out of the recession and back to growth. It did it in a responsible manner. So we took emergency measures necessary to stop the economic freefall, and since then we've had the fastest deficit reduction since just after World War II. We're now using a different policy, as we should. I mentioned that because of our Republican colleagues want to cut domestic spending even more, that's not sustainable. As the Center for Budget Priorities noted last year, spending cuts have exceeded tax increases by a 3-to-1 margin already. Put another way, for every dollar of new revenue that we have received, we have cut spending by $3.27. We've contracted, particularly on the discretionary domestic side. We need to come together and negotiate a deal that keeps the federal government open, not shut. The 2013 shutdown, according to Moody's analysis, cost the economy $20 billion and 120,000 jobs. Still, the so-called Tea Party Republicans and presidential candidates want to shut down the government right before the holidays. It's a misguided notion that it will somehow prevent Planned Parenthood from providing health care services to low-income women and their families. 2 years ago, the same individuals thought that shutting down government would prevent the Affordable Care Act from being implemented. They were wrong then, and they're wrong now. They damaged what they did by shutting down government, and they could do it again. And it's our standing in the world that is at jeopardy. A realistic budget deal will need to protect federal workers from further harm. Since 2011, federal workers have contributed $159 billion to deficit reduction. Federal workers have contributed $159 billion to deficit reduction. They didn't cause the deficit. They have endured 3 years of pay freezes and 2 substandard pay increases since then for a total of $137 billion. They lost another $1 billion in pay because of sequestration-related furloughs. And federal employees hired in 2013 and since 2014 are paying an extra $21 billion for their pensions. And each and every federal worker is being asked to do more with less as the agency's budgets are frozen or cut. This is happening to hardworking, patriotic public servants, mostly middle class, and struggling to get along like so many Americans. Enough is enough. Since the 1950s and 60s, the U.S. population has increased by 76%, and private sector workforce has surged 133%. But the size of the federal workforce has risen just 11%. Relative to the private sector, the federal workforce is less than 1/2 the size it was back in the 1950s and 60s. The picture that emerges is one of a federal civilian workforce whose size has significantly shrunk compared to the size of the U.S. population it serves, the private sector workforce, and the magnitude of various missions and federal expenditures. I would make the additional point that picking on federal workers on a budget deal or shutting down the government hurts veterans. Over 30% of the civilian federal employees are veterans, as compared to 7.8%. The federal government hires a lot more veterans, 30% of our workforce. Private sector, 7.8%. Another reason why we should be mindful of what we do to our federal workforce. Do we really want to cut the pay and benefits for these individuals even more than we have already? Or do we really want to force them to work during a shutdown but not pay them on time, or force them to stay home involuntarily and have to worry about whether they will be paid at all? Is this how we want to honor the men and women who stood in harm's way to defend our nation and continue to serve us? Mr. President, the missions that are carried out by our federal workforce, great missions, more work, less federal workers, it's time for us to recognize what they do for our country. Preventing federal workers from doing their jobs doesn't just harm them, it harms all Americans, because federal workers patrol our borders and make sure our air and water are clean and our food and drugs are safe. They support our men and women in uniform and care for our wounded warriors. They help our manufacturers compete abroad. They discover cures for life-threatening diseases. They prosecute criminals and terrorists. They maintain and protect critical infrastructure. They explore the universe. They process passport applications. They make sure Social Security, Medicare, and other social safety net programs are functioning properly. When federal workers do their job, they're helping each and every American live a safer and more prosperous life. Mr. President, our tasks here in Congress should be straightforward. First, we need to raise the debt ceiling so we can continue to pay our bills and maintain the full faith and credit of the United States government. Second, we need to keep the federal government open for business and keep federal workers on their job. Third, we need to negotiate a comprehensive budget deal that replaces sequestration, a budget that maintains critical federal investments while spreading the burden of deficit reduction in a fair way and holding federal workers and their families harmless after subjecting them to so much hardship over the past several months and years. And fourth, we need to reauthorize the Export-Import Bank, a bank that helps us with a level playing field on the international commerce, particularly with small companies. And we must reauthorize our surface transportation programs on a 6-year reauthorization. You can't do a major highway or bridge or transit program with a federal partner that only gives you a couple months of commitment. We need to have a multi-year transportation reauthorization passed. Mr. President, heretofore, one of the greatest attributes of the American character has been pragmatism. We can acknowledge and respect our differences, but at the end of the day, the American people have entrusted us with governing, and that means being pragmatic, sitting down, listening to each other, compromising, providing policies that will stand the test of time. Let us do our job on behalf of all Americans.